Hey guys, welcome to JR's Junk Drawer. I'm JR, this is Boots, and over here is Dukina. Today's episode is going to be the fourth and final part of the Clyde and the Magic Toast illustration series we've been working on. Today we're going to be taking the last of the sketches we worked on previously and finishing them up painting in Rebelle. This should be a lot of fun. Well, Rebelle is a computer program, so I guess we won't be needing this today. Oh well. Let's get started. Ooh. To avoid my initial goof, make sure you're not painting on the sketch layer. Yeah, mistakes were made. Starting again, this time we'll make sure to paint on a layer just below the sketch to avoid another situation.
Oh, sacre bleu, I'm melting. I'm melting. What a world. What a world.
I want to start by focusing on consistency. So I'm taking the three paintings we already finished last time and shrinking them to the side. This will give us a style reference and color palette to sample from, which will help to maintain continuity across the project. In this case, hair color, skin color, and shirt color have all been sampled from our first painting. Now the toast was interesting to paint, specifically working on the burn. For this, Rebelle had a brush that had the perfect texture, so I scattered it about by tapping around. And as long as your effect is on a separate layer, you'll be able to use an eraser to clean and touch things up. Try not to think of the eraser as only something to remove mistakes, but instead as a tool in its own right that can be as useful as the brush. I tried using a little anime trick to block out the eyes and help focus the painting's intent on the rest of the image, primarily the toast. Later, after deciding that it didn't look right, I did remove the effect. It just didn't add anything to the overall painting and was more distracting than helpful. We're getting to the final touches on this painting, but rather than summarizing, let's actually dive into what I'm doing step by step. This request comes from one of you in the comments section. Thank you, Patrick. I hope this helps out. I'll also put in a video of the time you referenced from last episode near the end of today's speed painting, but this time more slowed down and with some more explanation. So, final touches. It's a very diverse part of my painting process, where I'll work on a little bit of everything. At its core, it's a detailed look around the painting, keeping an eye out for anything that needs to be fixed or tweaked before calling an image finished. Here I noticed that the paint had bled over the outlines in a few places I would have preferred to keep it contained. And the outlines themselves needed a little more contrast in a couple places. If there's some lighting that I missed, or maybe part of the image should be darker, this is where I handle all of that. Naturally, that involves a lot of zooming out to get a bird's eye view of the painting. And anything that catches my eye gets fixed on the spot in preparation for the effects that come next. A Rebelle specific part of this process involves making sure all the paint drips look right. Starting on the effects for this painting, I first make a new layer above everything else, most of the time including the outlines, but sometimes I do make it below the outlines, so you're just going to have to try that for yourself and see which way you prefer. I then change the new layer's blending mode to overlay and start painting. It's essential to keep an eye on the colors I'm using for this step, as I add glow for the lighting and some subtle hue changes for some extra vibrance. This is where I take my intended focal points and really push them to the forefront. Sometimes this involves multiply blending modes to add contrast, and other times it requires color or linear dodge to make a subject pop. Different images and art styles call for different blending modes. But optimally, if I've done my job right, this is where a painting will really come together. Once again, the first thing I do is collect all the previous paintings on the side of my canvas as thumbnails. And the first brush strokes I place down build my background color splash. For the background, I have continued to keep continuity with the blues and purples that exist across this project. Now let's take a few minutes to talk about lighting. Thank you Virus Manga for suggesting this topic. Lighting is one of the most crucial things in a painting. It's what gives an image depth, and without it, everything would look flat. So it's vital to have a solid three-dimensional visualization of your scene, and know roughly where your lighting is coming from. In this picture, while I've already determined where the light is coming from, I'm holding off on filling it all in. And the reason why is very straightforward. Lighting is contrast, at least part of it, and before I balance the lighting, I want to have in place my darkest items so that I can see what I'm balancing that contrast against. In this case, I've made the thought bubble a very dark blue. I did this so that I could add in a lot of glowing effects that make it look more magical. A great way of adding glowing effects is with a blending mode like color dodge. If you apply a small amount of the intended color with a soft brush, your target can appear to be emitting light, or at the very least, reflecting light. Glowing effects they're a great way to make an image pop, and honestly, a ton of fun to work with. Back over on the face, there's a small tip I want to highlight, no pun intended. If you darken the shadows right along the hard seam where they meet the light, it can add a dynamic look to your image. Now, you can do this with the selection tool or with alpha lock as long as your shadows have been kept on a separate layer. But either way, this is a tip you can see me using across many of my paintings. It's not something you want to overemphasize, but I think it looks really good with a small amount of darkening. Now, lighting is a complex topic, and if I'm being honest, it deserves its own 101 tutorial. So keeping in mind this art style and what you know from my fan art episodes, would a full 101 lighting tutorial be something you'd like to see from me? If enough of you push for that, I'll happily get started on it. It might take some time, I've got some other projects lined up, but something like that could be a lot of fun. Now we need to paint the bread and butter, literally. Most of this is pretty self-explanatory, so it's an excellent chance to talk about the outlines. Like all the other paintings in this project, I've changed the outline layer's blending mode to overlay. This helps the colors overall to look more vivid, but it is crucial to come back in underneath the outlines and darken some of them up by resketching underneath them. I've also dropped a shadow underneath these items to bring them off the background colors and add some more separation. Time for the idealized toast. I want this to almost have the colors of a psychedelic dream sequence. The background is going to be edge to edge on our canvas. After that, we'll start on the plate of toast in the center. The lighting angle I chose was pretty arbitrary. On the other hand, the burn pattern turned out perfect. Makes me almost sad to have to cover it up with the butter. Take note that I've paused time during the painting to prevent any spreading of the pattern. I also proceed to go ahead and dry the layer before I ever resume time. I decided that color dodge would make a better choice for the finishing touches this time around. I wanted all the elements in the background to have a nice glow to them. I don't know, maybe I'm pushing the design over the top. You decide. But I'm not going to stop till it's done. This painting is also an excellent example of what I mean when I say I come back in after painting to add the drips in a separate step, and also on a separate layer so that I can paint them in without destroying the colors underneath. You know, my painting process wouldn't be complete if I didn't experiment with weird ways of applying and removing paint. To replicate what you're seeing now, start with the layer you want to remove the paint from, and along the edge you want the drips to encroach from, paint with the color white or black. And when you're happy with the look, go to Filter and press either white to alpha or black to alpha, depending on which color you painted with. Honestly, it's probably not something I'll use going forward, as it does change the colors you're trying to work with. But I wanted to highlight what's going on just in case some of you were interested. Next up, we have what Clyde peered around the corner to find. The preparation of the toast, with no magic involved. Only ingredients and tools. I do like how this sketch turned out. Definitely a favorite from this project. It might be simple, but there's just something about this one that I like. Our last painting today will be of Clyde's mom. This one is a real showcase painting, so I'm making sure to put some extra effort into its design. And that starts with the shadows and highlights. You have to make sure that even if the shadows don't fall exactly where they technically should, that their placement at least looks good and complements the overall concept balance. My mental approach to painting, and this goes for my regular art style too, is that accuracy and precision are not the most important things. That's a little funny coming from me, considering how much I dive into the details, but unless your goal is to paint something that's true to life, you have a lot of wiggle room in a painting to play around with the details. Things like the placement of a shadow don't have to be exact, as long as they're close. What matters so much more is the presentation of your focal points. If you make sure that something looks really good where it matters, you'll find you have more freedom in your process in other areas. For me, focal points change from painting to painting, but still, the one thing that I always try to emphasize are the eyes, or at the very least, the expression of a character. Because I feel that if you can nail that down, if you can get that just right, you can breathe life into a character, and all the other details of a painting will fall in line, either supporting or contrasting against your focal points. Before we wrap up today, as promised, here is a deep dive into the finishing touches from our last Rebelle episode. Enjoy. Now, full disclaimer, this was my first painting in this art style. There's a lot of experimentation in this process. So, it's less important to follow this painting step by step than it is to understand the obstacle that was in front of me and how I went about fixing it. With that out of the way, let's talk about what my problem was. Primarily, my colors and lighting were too dark and weren't popping. I felt that a watercolor look should be much more lightly colored, so I got to work brightening things up. Through this process, make sure to pay attention to which layers I make an edit on and what blending mode I set each layer to. I'm currently working on a brand new layer that I set to screen. I'm using some bright saturated colors to add some hue shifting to the underlining painting. Honestly, a little too much at first, which is why I reduced the layer's opacity and came back in with an eraser to decrease the effect. The next step happens fast, but is very important. I duplicated the group containing the paint for Clyde, his mom, and the table. So, no outlines, no background color splash. I then flattened that duplicate into a single layer. And the first edit I made to that duplicate, unfortunately, was not captured by my recording software. Thankfully, this step was pretty straightforward. All I did was use a hue and saturation adjustment to play with the color and brightness. You can find that window under the filter tab. The results I have right now, much closer to what I'm looking for. But I would be remiss if I didn't mess around with the blending modes. I cycled through the blending modes a lot. This actually went on for quite some time. I had a hard time making up my mind. So I'm going to speed this part up a little more. There were no changes I made here. Only 10 minutes of me indecisively picking a blending mode before I settled on linear dodge with an extremely low opacity. So at this point, I'm also taking the time to duplicate the duplicate. So now I have the original group and 2 copies, which I had adjusted with the hue and saturation earlier. I set the lower duplicate to a blending mode of normal and an opacity of 62%. And the top copy was set to linear dodge with an opacity of 5%. Now I would not recommend following this process strictly. This is not a formula to make your painting look good. It's an example of a problem and solution I faced. And like with a lot of things in painting, there are multiple ways to reach the same goal. It's more important to become familiar with the tools at your disposal than it is to learn a set of instructions to solve a particular problem. But that is actually all the paintings we have for today. All done. Well, this project has been a lot of fun. Experimenting with the new art style is always a great way of learning new tricks and improving your overall technique. Even when the art style is a complete departure from your regular paintings, there's almost always something to... Hey girl. There's almost always something to learn from being hands-on with content outside your comfort zone. So experiment, paint something different. Follow a tutorial. It doesn't have to be perfect. And if there's anything that I've learned over the years, it's that, honestly, it doesn't even have to be good. It only matters that you make the attempt. And that very fact, practiced through repetition, is what drives improvement. But that is going to be all for today. Over here is the full Clyde and the Magic Toast storybook, and here's a video YouTube thinks you might like. Anyways, thank you all for joining me, and I hope to see you next time when we dive into painting Wattson.